So the Sony a7 IV can shoot 422 10-bit color for video. And the reason why this is important is because you get more color information in your video, more color resolution, and that will result in an image that has a lot more detail and it's easier to color correct and color grade.
Wow, that color is beautiful.
So if you have the Sony a7 IV, you might not know of this hack where you can actually shoot in 422 10-bit color when shooting at 120 frames per second. I'll also be doing a little bit of a test with 10-bit color and non-10-bit color and 120 frames per second, and to test that slow motion, and we'll see whether that makes a difference. I'm pretty sure it does, but the main difference is that you get a little bit more data information with 8-bit as opposed to 10-bit on the Sony a7 IV, at least on paper when shooting at 120 frames per second, but we'll find out. So this camera can shoot 4K video up to 60 frames per second. You can only access 120 frames per second if you shoot in HD mode in 1080p. And you can also get 422 10-bit in every frame rate except for 120 frames per second, or at least that's what you may think. But before I show you, welcome back to another video. If you're new here, please hit the like button, subscribe for more videos if you're interested in all things videography, filmmaking, and photography. And if you already subscribed and you came back, thank you again so much for being here. It's great to see you back here again. So let me show you how you can access this in camera. So I'll turn this to video mode. 4K, you can shoot all the way to 60 frames per second. And in XAVC SHD at 120 frames per second, you can only do 100 megabits per second and 420 8-bit. And if you go to XAVC SI HD, you can't even do 120 frames per second. So you are restricted to these frame rates, which can all do 422 10-bit. So that is in video mode. But if you switch this dial to S&Q, under shooting, go to image quality, S&Q settings, recording frame rate. This is going to be the frame rate of the finished S&Q movie, and I want that to be at 24 frames per second. The frame rate here is actually the capture frame rate. This is where we'll be selecting 120 frames per second. You can also go all the way down to 1 frames per second, and that is if you're shooting a time lapse. So let's select 120 frames per second. That will be 5 times slow motion. And as you can see, this is grayed out, but it says 89 megabits per second in 422 10-bit color. So it's about 11 megabits less data information like in video mode, but you do get 422 10-bit color. And if we do something else, we switch from XAVC SI, which is all intro and HD, to XAVC SHD, which should have a smaller data rate. Go now here into S&Q settings. This is the same, 120 frames per second. Now we have a little bit more options for this, but as you can see, we can only capture 422 10-bit up to 50 megabits per second, as opposed to the 80 megabits per second that you had in XAVC S all intro mode in HD. For the best results, select these settings so you get the best color information out of your 120 frames per second footage in HD on the Sony a7 IV. Another thing to keep in mind is when you are in video mode on your camera, you cannot shoot at 120 frames per second in the XAVC S intra format. As you can see here, there is no option to select 120 frames per second. You can only access that when you go to XAVC SHD, and then you can access 120 frames per second, but you still don't get the 10-bit color. So the main drawback when using S&Q mode to shoot your 120 frames per second video is that sound is not recorded. And this might be or not be an issue for you depending on what you're shooting. If you're shooting slow motion and at the same time you're trying to get the sound of whatever object you're shooting, then S&Q might not be the mode you're looking for. An alternative is to shoot whatever you're shooting twice, one in regular video just to capture that audio, and one in S&Q to get 120 frames per second in 422 10-bit color. A good thing about S&Q mode though is that you can watch and play back in real time what that slow motion clip that you have just captured at 120 frames per second is going to look like when slowed down. And this can be very useful when you're reviewing footage on the spot when you're shooting. That way you get an idea if what you're filming is actually going to look like what you have in mind. When filming at 120 frames per second in regular video mode, you don't get to see this in camera because you just see a playback of 120 frames per second, and you won't be able to see what it looks like when slowed down to, let's say, a 24 frames per second timeline. So if it's slowed down to 20%, you can't really see that in the playback of the camera unless you bring that footage into your video editing software and slow it down then, and then check it out there. So I shot this clip in regular video mode at 1080p in 8-bit color, which has a little bit of a higher data rate versus the 10-bit color equivalent of 120 frames per second in S&Q mode. So at first glance, you might not see much of a difference, but as soon as I add a more extreme color correction or color grade, then you can see that the 8-bit footage starts to fall apart. So in my brief observation of just this clip, it does seem like even though the file size is a little bit smaller in the S&Q mode in 10-bit color at 120 frames per second, you still get more color information as opposed to shooting in a slightly higher data rate at 120 frames per second in regular video mode. Another reason why you may want to choose the 10-bit color version is that if you're doing green screen work, you get a much easier key when you have more color information. So your green screen stuff is just gonna look way better. So there you have it. I hope you found this video useful, and here are a couple of videos on the Sony a7 IV that you might be interested in watching next, and I'll see you there.